Well, according to my calendar, it's Monday. Once again, these Mondays, they come around almost like clockwork, Mike. I don't know how this happens. They surprise me routinely. I'm not going to lie. They just
Yeah.
kind of come out of nowhere. I mean, it seems like, at least to me, this whole pandemic thing kind of has blown away the whole, like, what is time? How does time work? It's just one meeting after another, apparently. But
Yep.
good morning, Mike. I can officially say good morning to you. It is afternoon for me, but good morning for those of you living in the past. So, hi, Mike. How you doing?
Oh, good. How you doing?
Pleasure. Well, thanks for hanging out with me. I appreciate it. It was good to spend some time with you in October in, I think, certainly one of my favorite cities. I feel the same for you, though. We got to hang out in Barcelona, and so thanks
Yeah.
for agreeing to hang out with me here on the Twitch on a random Monday morning. I do see if I can move my head the right way. I casually placed your book in line of sight here.
I see it there. That's cool.
People
Thanks.
could remember that. And my wife was asking me this morning, she's like, so who's your guest today? And I said, oh, Mike Feathers. And she's like, do I know Mike? I'm like, you probably have not met him. But I said, he wrote this book. And so there we go. So
Yeah.
for those of you out there who aren't familiar with your bio, which I can't imagine who that would be, but what's your origin story? How did you get into this whole strange technology space? And I have a myriad of questions about how you decided to write a book about legacy code, but we'll get to that. So
Yeah,
what's your origin
sure.
story?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny thing because I think, for me as a kid, I had a bit of trouble trying to figure out what I wanted to do in life, right? And I think one of the things that was interesting for me as I was a teenager is kind of recognizing that when I closed my eyes, buildings would appear that I didn't put there in a sense. Right? I had a very spatial, imagination in a sense. So I thought, okay, well, I'll become an architect, right? So went to college and started taking architecture courses and was terrified because this was like right in the days previous to CAD. And apparently you had to learn how to draw, right, to do this. And next to people that had been drawing since they were infants pretty much and doing very, very well. So I did only a couple of courses in that and then decided to kind of like switch into mathematics and then engineering and everything like that. And it was kind of fun to go and sort of like arrive at software development because it was kind of the 1980s and very nascent at that point in time. And just recognizing I had an aptitude for it. And then also realizing as time went on that it touches everything. I mean, software just really touches everything from human behavior to structuring principles that were like available in, building architecture and stuff along those lines. So I just found it a very easy place to kind of like find a home and just get real good. And of course, going to conferences and meeting extremely interesting people that have wide ranges of interests was fascinating to me because I was a bit of a, I guess, God, what do you call that? A person who reads everything as a teenager, and so fun stuff. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's such a great point. I was saying that to my son the other day. Like, software is eating the world, to quote, I guess that was Mark Cuban, right, who originally said that. And it's everywhere. And I don't know that I would have predicted that even when I was in school studying this stuff, just how pervasive technology has gotten in our lives. It's everywhere. I mean, I can't think of a space that software has not in some way, shape, or form changed, adjusted, modified for better or worse. I guess good for us, right? I mean, that it gives us something fun to do and no shortage of toys to play with. But
it's kind of funny about that too, because back in the 80s, when I went to college and finally settled on like taking computer courses, right? There's a friend of mine who was like deeply into business, and it was kind of like he was a business major and everything like that. They said, Mike, you're wasting your time. It's kind of like in a couple of years, all the programs that need to be written will be written. And I went into a funk for about 3-4 months at the time, thinking, because I went to his house and he had like one of the first IBM PCs, I guess, that I'd ever seen, and I was like getting into it. And he's like, "Yeah, this pointless. There's no future there." And I'm like,
"Oh my gosh,
okay. And,
all the programs
that
we'll need will have been written."
Yeah. It's wild stuff.
Wow, it's in retrospect obviously sounds incredibly naive, but then again, go back far enough and good old COBOL, the whole idea there is you won't need any more of us because the business people will just write their own code. So how's that working?
Predictions about the future are notoriously wrong, I guess. And
right.
Nice. Keeps us all humble.
Exactly. Well, I mean, that's such a good point. You think about all the stuff that's changed just in the span of the last 5, 10, 15 years. I think a lot about these little slabs of glass that we carry with us everywhere.
Yeah.
you look at a movie even from just 20 years ago, and this idea of like a cell phone is so foreign to what we have today. You could not have predicted that in the 90s or the early aughts that we'd all walk around with that in our pocket and doing all this crazy stuff. And you think
Star
about how
Trek,
many things.
to be fair.
Yeah, it's getting there, right? And we're not, I think we overestimate, again, I think this, now I'm quoting Gates, overestimate where we'll be in 2 years, but underestimate where we'll be in 10 or 20, whatever.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense.
And I think it'll be really interesting to see sort of where this stuff all goes in the next 20 years here. Oh, so Glenn says he had a teacher that told him in the late 80s that software was dying. So apparently really great predictions there about the future.
Yeah.
But
and it's wild about that too, because I forget who it was, but I think there was somebody who was appointed to be like the director of the patent office in the early 1900s, or late 1900s, I guess, and basically said, no, this is ridiculous. Everything that needs to be invented will be invented shortly.
Right.
And
right.
So there's a long history to this kind of thing of like, that's not going to work. That's ridiculous.
No. Well, how would you even predict some of these things as they come together? I mean, look at self-driving cars. What's going to happen when that happens? I mean, it's going to happen, whether that's in the next 5 years or 20 years, who knows, but eventually we'll take the humans out of that equation. What does that do to how we design cities? What does that do to how we design houses? You think about how many homes have
I think it's just going to be like a bit of it's all going to just sort of like happen slowly before people even notice it happening. Right. I ran into somebody at a conference a couple of years ago who was basically saying with self-driving cars, there were people involved in the initiatives that were basically going and hiring like science fiction writers to brainstorm about different possibilities. And I think one of the possibilities they came up with is like, what if you have teenagers jumping in front of these cars because they know the car is going to go and stop? It's kind of like that, this interesting thing of kind of like just sort of, stepping outside the box and thinking about what the implications of technology are. And it's like, it's not like those things necessarily come true. And it's not like you have to go and count for every one of them, but that thought exercise is just really, really interesting to me, that kind of thing with any new technology.
God, that's a great point. I hadn't even thought of that. I think about it from the standpoint of a parent of a teenager.
Yeah.
The sheer amount of time I've had to drive him around to things.
Yep.
And how much he's learning how to drive now, right? So he'll get his license soon, for some value of soon. Scheduling a test, by the way, right now, at least in Minnesota, is a complete cluster. Trying to get one locally, forget about it. One of our friends, their daughter's birthday was in February, this past February. Her test was in November. That was the soonest she could get a test. Yep. So I know plenty of people who've had to take tests 250 miles out of the cities, 500 miles out of the cities, because there's no capacity for whatever reason inside the 7-county metro area. So he'll get his license eventually. And I'm kind of excited about that, but I'm also terrified, right?
Yeah, no, totally. It makes a lot of sense. I think my kids are in their 20s now, but I thought back in the early days, it's kind of like it'd be good to live in a city because I was terrified of my teenagers driving. It's kind of like, if all I have to worry about is the subway, that's okay. But,
it's a good point. It's a good point. No, I look for, it would have been nice to have that self-driving car thing though, just to like send the car to send him to practice or pick him up or whatever, and not have to twiddle thumbs for an hour and a half waiting for something to finish. But I guess that's the role of being a parent, right, Mike? I mean, we get to do those things for our kids.
Yeah, totally.
Hopefully they'll remember that when we're older and need their help. Got to take dad to a doctor's appointment. Sorry, kid. This is payback for all those soccer practices you had to go to. But
there you go. Maybe the first one.
I think so. May you live in interesting times. It's funny you brought up sort of the business sort of reaction to software. Your friend is all the programs that have been written. I think one of the ways I've seen this industry change over the last 20 plus years, I remember coming out of school and the CIO gave a presentation to all the new hires, and he was very adamant. We're not a technology company. We are a cost center. We're here to support the business. He didn't go quite so far as to say we're just order takers, but that's kind of what he was implying. And I thought that was a little strange because I knew how big our budget was, and I knew that IT was the largest employee center in the entire company. It's like, boy, for a company that's not a technology company, we spend a lot on technology. But 20-ish years later, I'm with a different client, and their CIO gets up and says the exact opposite. We are a technology company that happens to be in retail. What do you think helped move that shift? I mean, I'm sure you've seen similar things with your clients, and what are the implications for that moving forward as more companies grasp the fact that we're all technology companies?
Gosh, I guess with implications, and maybe if I think for a second, I'll have something to say about that. But I think about the shift itself. It's just the fact that software is relatively easy to write, not necessarily easy to write well, right? But it's
Yes.
very easy to generate incremental value by going and writing software in
Sure.
ways that were never even possible with hardware development and stuff along those
Sure.
lines, right? So it's like then it becomes the competitive part of the competitive landscape between companies. It's kind of like if we can sort of outmaneuver the other company by going and writing some additional software that goes and solves a problem, basically the entire value proposition moves in that space, which is kind of fascinating.
Hmm.
I don't really know where things go beyond that right now, though. I mean, because it
Sure.
seems like there's nothing which is quite as flexible as software that allows us to go and basically do the things that we need to do, and
Sure.
it's weird about this too, because with AI, and I think sometimes people look at biology as being like a possible competitor. Yeah, I think AI is probably the more the more interesting competitor right now to that space, but it's
Sure.
hard to see what the
Sure.
differentiators would be.
Oh, that's a good point, and we should definitely touch on that. We got Ugly Snout has joined us. Fuel Snable, good morning or good evening, Fuel Snable. I got to get my time zones all right
Yeah.
here. It's the joy of our industry. Um,
Mhm.
so one of the things I've thought a lot about. You make a great point. It's hard to write software well. I think we'll get
Mhm.
better at it, and we've only been doing this for like a human generation, so we have to be a little patient with ourselves. But one of the things that I find so fascinating about this space is how people have these very unrealistic expectations for our ability to estimate, and they make these huge changes and then expect it has no ramification to schedule or budget. And given
Yeah.
your initial sort of thoughts around doing architecture, the real architecture, not the software
Mhm.
architecture I pretend to do,
Mhm.
no one would ever do that with a building, right? I mean, you'd never see somebody start building a hotel and be
Mhm.
like, well, now that we've thought about it, we'd really like the hotel to be 27 stories instead of 13
Yeah.
stories, and then expect that that has no ramifications,
Mhm.
right? They'd be like, of course I'm going to have to spend more money, and we'll have to maybe redo things.
Mhm.
Or sorry, we just can't even do it because the foundation's already been laid and there's literally no way to fix it.
Mhm.
Do you think we'll ever get people to figure out that software does have some of those constraints? I mean, it's obviously easier to refactor software than the physical world, but it isn't effortless yet either.
Yeah, I think. Well, it's kind of funny because it's kind. You have to put. I have to put myself in the mindset of a person who's like a purely a business person without very much software exposure. But they definitely see the delays, right? They definitely see
Hmm.
the amount of time it takes to kind of like bring something to fruition or basically have it center upon the thing that they need. I think that basically now it's kind of generational. I think we're seeing a lot of younger people who kind of like get a feel for software,
Mm,
even if they don't know
sure.
very much about it, right? And I think that as you pointed out, we're a very young industry, and we're probably going to be seeing less and less holdover from like the mechanical disciplines and stuff along those lines,
Sure. Sure.
or at least like the big batch, type of thing that happened, and particularly things like just-in-time manufacturing and inventory and stuff along those lines. I think that at a mathematical level, they probably all have the same kind of shape. There's kind of like
Sure.
there's this thing of like building up capacity and basically centering on something, and then it's kind of like then you have something which is kind of like going to work for quite a bit period of time, and change in one direction or another is going to be a little bit slow. It's not instantaneous, and people start to go and get a
Hmm.
feel for those things. But that's just my sense of it. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah,
Um,
I saw a tweet not too long ago that basically said, civil engineering, oh, we've been working with this material for 3,000 years. We
mhm.
understand the tensile strength of this, and all these different engineering disciplines and how they've found their foundations years and years and years ago. And then software. Hey, have you using that new Foo library that came out on Tuesday? And we're constantly reinventing things,
Mhm.
or we don't have that stable foundation the same way that buildings do, where like, yeah, we've worked with concrete now for a couple millennia. I think we're sort of
Yeah.
getting it figured out. Do you think we'll ever get there? I mean, is that going to happen in our lifetimes? I mean, I'm not holding my breath, but
Well, yeah, that's the thing too. It really depends on what you consider the ground to be, right? Because the ground
sure.
could be the operating system that you're working on or the particular hardware and stuff like that. And it has particular characteristics that you can kind of count on over a period of time. But that's really
Hmm.
like a platform thing in a sense. It's like
Sure.
how stable is the platform? Is it stable for my entire career, for instance? And chances
Sure.
are the answer is no in general.
Sure.
But I think that there are certain aspects of software that are, to me, they're really fascinating because they kind of like match the physical world in a way, right? It's
Oh,
kind
sure.
of, here's the thing which I think about a lot. which is really utterly fascinating to me. And it's like the entire notion of modularity in a sense, right? It's kind of like we make modules because we have like that, the 7 plus or minus 2 rule. It's kind of like to be able to go and fit this much stuff in your head, it has to be reasonably sized, right? So this goes and leads us to go and have like classes and functions, which are pieces in a sense, pieces that we kind of like glom together in a sense. And to me, this is not, it's not just metaphor to go and say that this is what biology does in a way too. You're not just a giant hunk of protoplasm. It requires the support of cell walls to go and kind of like keep things together. And you can look at that as being the result of forces. You have the, like, instead of having a giant vat of protoplasm and, hey, here's your, here's your animal. It's kind of like nature's kind of segregated things or pieced things together in ways that the entire thing can kind of grow. So we end up going and doing the same thing in software in a way. It's like forming these chunks, and these chunks basically have, there are certain forces that prevent them from getting too large. And then you have more and more chunks that you kind of add to it. And I think it really is, the result of like certain foundational stresses and forces. And those kind of stresses and forces may manifest differently in software as in, or in, in biology or in mechanical systems, but they're kind of similar in a way. And I think that looking at those similarities is something which is kind of powerful for us in a way.
Sure.
There's definitely a thing with software where I think it's way more like biology than most people appreciate in a way. It just kind of like grows. And I used to put a slide up and talks of like a giant forest of kudzu or something like that. And it's kind of like, this is your code base. Everybody say, yes, of course, that's my code base. So we are learning these things. It's kind of fascinating.
Right. I think Kent tweeted something about that last year or so about how, the systems that we're building keep getting larger and larger and larger, but the human brain hasn't grown in millennia, right? And so the idea of trying to load these problems in our brain isn't getting any easier. So we keep breaking it up into chunks that we actually can fit in between our ears. And I think that's a great point, that a lot of this is more biological in nature than we've maybe given it credit for.
Yeah, and look at what medical doctors do. Essentially, it's kind of like a lot of rules of thumb and studies that point in particular directions. But any doctor who's being realistic will just say, we don't know it this fully. This is kind of where things trend. And we basically give you this treatment because we think that on the average, it trends in this way.
Right.
It helps, so.
Well, and to your point, there's so many things that come out in the medical space, and I'm blanking on the terminology behind this, but we will find a substance that makes your headache go away, but we don't know why. But we know it works, and we have studies that tell us it works, but we don't understand the pathway. And it may take us 100 years to understand that pathway, but we know it works. And I wonder if we're going to have a similar thing in software, especially, talking about AI, where, well, I mean, it works. We don't understand why, but it works. We'll figure it out, maybe, or maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe the artificial intelligence will be smarter than us the entire time and probably fine.
Well, and it's funny because it seems like society adapts to those things pretty well in a way. I think with like self-driving cars, there's that thing of kind of like, you're going to put the car in control. What happens if something goes wrong? How do we figure out how it went wrong? And with a lot of things involving, say, neural networks in general, it's kind of like, it's really hard to go and generate the story that you can tell the human about what's actually happened. I guess the thing that's interesting is that society tends to adapt to these things once you get past the threshold where the technology is better than was there previously. So for self-driving cars, if fewer people die using them than did prior to them, then it's kind of like we might be able to live with the ignorance to some degree, but who knows?
Oh, absolutely. Well, and you think about the number of people who die in car accidents, whether they're in the car, whether they're pedestrian that gets hit, undoubtedly it's going to save tens of thousands of lives. And of course, it will be front page news the first time the self-driving car drives a family of 4 off a cliff.
Yeah.
But, I think it'll take us some time to get comfortable with that. But ultimately, it should be a net benefit, I would think.
Yeah, makes sense to me too. Yeah.
Let's see, what do we got in the comments here? So Fuel Snable says complexity of software is abstract and hidden to most, including myself. I think that's true for a lot of us as we're writing software. Like, I don't really know what's going on here, but it worked, so it's probably fine.
Yeah.
What could possibly go wrong? Let's see. Making a AAA graphics game is as easy as checking a box. I think so, right? I've never worked in the gaming industry, but
yeah, me either.
it's probably a fairly straightforward, just a small matter of implementation detail. Like,
Yeah.
let's see. Oh, this is interesting. So Glenn says a lot of times people respect it when the software goes wrong. Yeah, that's an interesting point. When it makes a mistake, is that when people start to realize that there is complexity behind this, and that it maybe isn't so easy to just refactor the code.
Yeah, yeah. I think it also kind of plays to our conceit as humans too. It's kind of like,
Mhm.
hey, that software is, it's not omnipotent. It's kind of like we have our
Right,
place. Which is a
right.
useful thing to remind ourselves about.
Do you think we'll ever have any kind of, I don't know, code of ethics? Or I remember reading something about someone who graduated with an engineering degree, and
Mm,
they said, tomorrow after I graduated, if I give you advice, I'm legally responsible for that. Today, no,
mhm.
because I haven't graduated yet. But once I graduate, say the same thing to you, and it turns out, you build your building wrong, then that's on me. Do you think we'll ever get anything like that in software? I mean, is it possible?
Um, I think, well, wow, it's a very interesting thing. I mean, if I can kind of like lay out what I see right now about this, there was a book I picked up a long time ago, and I think it was called After the Gold Rush. It might have
Oh,
been Steve
yeah.
McConnell, but I'm not really sure. But it was really talking about, I think, in the beginning of the early 90s, about like, okay,
Mhm.
this is like the Wild West, and at some point regulation is going to come in. And I've
Sure.
heard that story over and over and over again. And the thing that I think is a countervailing force against that, in a sense, is that generally, things that can affect human life severely quite often have a hardware component, in a sense.
Mm,
So my understanding is, and I could be wrong about this, that essentially you usually have a licensed engineer who signs off on that, plus the software and everything. And
okay.
because of that, that's where the legal authority comes from to basically do
Sure.
particular things. But I think the thing that's really weird about software is it's kind of like there's such a slope to software, in a sense. I used to joke with people and say it's like, well, the Michelin star chef and the guy who makes you hot dogs at the airport are in the same
Yes.
industry, right?
Yes.
And in much the same way, software
Mhm.
has that same characteristic. You'll find people doing very, very life critical systems, and then other people who are just basically doing like, one-off scripts at a mom and pop, shop or something like that.
Right.
And so it's kind of like there's enough value on the low end to basically sort of like not, it's hard for us to figure where the line would be to go and actually talk about regulation. So my guess
Right.
is that regulation probably happens in financial areas, and then maybe tied to engineering around, medical things and stuff along those lines. I think that's kind of covered in a sense.
Sure, sure.
But it's, I don't want to use the word slippery slope, but there's a slope there, and it
Right.
makes it hard to go and find a cutoff line. I think, like most other regulatory things, there would have to be a really severe crisis before people
Mhm.
start going in and getting in Congress and yelling and doing something about that in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially here. We don't seem super inclined to enforce some of those things, but
We
that makes
close
me
the
wonder,
barn
like,
door after,
oh,
almost
right,
after.
right, exactly. Hey, we should do something about all these social networks. They're bad for kids. Yeah, that ship has sailed. I don't think there's a whole lot we
Mhm.
can do to put the genie back in the bottle. I, I do wonder, again, getting back to self-driving car things, if that maybe spurs some of this, because eventually that will touch everybody. I mean, there won't be, you know, in positive and negative ways. I mean, I've also thought about like what
Mhm.
happens when all the long haul truckers are essentially put out of business because
Yeah.
we have a self-driving semi truck that can drive 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Mhm.
Um, don't need however many hundreds of thousands of long haul truckers we currently have. But if we start seeing this self-driving car software misbehave in ways we hadn't anticipated, I wonder if maybe that is a forcing function on some of that. But
It could
maybe
very
that's
well be, and I think it really comes down to just having an extraordinarily bad event. Okay, that kind of
right,
like pushes people. It's hard to even really kind of predict that kind of thing with these things.
right, right.
But
Yeah.
it's really a weird thing about technology this way that I find fascinating. If you remember, like the Segway, remember that at all?
Mhm. Yeah.
Right? So it's kind of like, yeah, it's kind of mall cop, basically the guy riding along on the thing and stuff like that.
Right.
I
Right.
forget the name of the guy who actually invented it. I remember him going on all these news programs, going and talking about his great invention without
Hmm.
saying what it was, right? And
Hmm.
he kept doing that over and over again. And then there was the big reveal. And then almost immediately, and I think maybe even, yeah, almost immediately, you'd have different municipalities going and trying to form regulation against them, because it's kind of like, okay, we have to
Sure.
contain this and do something about it. Um, but it's always the technologies that basically are stealth and basically gain public acceptance very, very
Sure.
quickly before regulators are even aware of them, that tend to kind of
Mhm.
like move forward in interesting ways. It's very much like the story of Uber in a way, right? They were very,
Yeah.
very stealth. Of course, they did some very shady things as well, but it's kind of like, but it's this thing of kind of like, everybody loves this service. So how can you actually regulate against it, right?
Right.
So it's
Right.
like there's that slow thing of being behind the scenes that basically allows technology to kind of like take over in some sense. And
Right.
if you look at like, I think there's law about photography, which basically goes and says, hey, you can take pictures of anything in public and that's okay.
Mhm.
Would it have happened that way if basically cell phone cameras were available immediately?
It's a good
Probably
point.
not.
That's a good
It's
point.
just because the technology advanced behind the scenes in a way where there's already a hook into the public about what they want.
Mhm.
It's funny.
Well, and look at how that technology changed. When
Mhm.
cameras first came out, very cumbersome, very large. You couldn't hide one on your person. It was right
Yeah.
here. And now they're so small, it's very easy. I have been on, I noticed, I think it was this year, and I don't know, the only airline I've heard this on is KLM, but part of their announcement when you get on board is recording of people, taking photos of people without their consent is not allowed on our aircraft. And so
Mhm.
it's interesting to see them trying to take back some of that, because to your point, we're all walking around with pretty darn good cameras in our pockets, and now they're so small you could embed one in your t-shirt without a whole lot of effort
Yeah.
if you really wanted to.
So then we get a shift to the
What a-
private space. It's very much like not allowing cell
right,
phones at concerts. People are
right.
able to create a private space because the public space is basically living with the rules that were basically created many decades ago.
Hmm. God, it's funny you bring up Sego. I remember that was being touted as this game changer, revolutionary. Cities will never be the same again. And it's like you came out with a fancy scooter.
Yeah.
Cool. And it's
Hmm.
how expensive? And I guess unless you were, Woz or something like that, you couldn't afford to play, polo with them. So
Yeah.
when is the last time you saw a Segway other than the mall cop, I guess?
Yeah. No. And what tourists for cities, right? It's like,
Yeah.
there's
Oh,
this.
yeah. That's a good point. I definitely see them there. I guess that's where they're useful, and I guess I've seen cops use them sometimes in like airports or other places with
Mhm.
large ground to cover in a number of spaces here. So yeah, Glenn asks a good question. Can government agencies keep up? And I think about that in terms of the EU and their new everything must be USB-C moving forward,
Mhm.
and they have another regulation coming in 24, I think, around app stores, where they're going to force Google and Apple to allow alternative ways of getting apps on your phone, basically. And I'm not a lawyer, I don't pretend to know what that means, but this is my concern about this too, though. When governments, laws, norms move a lot slower than technology, do we hem ourselves? Do we paint ourselves into a corner by saying, "Oh, it's all got to be USB-C now," and then in 5 years, when I don't know, USB-C plus plus comes out, we can't go to it because the law won't change for another 10 years. I don't know.
Well, it's really an interesting thing, and I think for the EU and like other governments, it's like there's a real dance there because essentially their constituents basically want technology as well too, right?
Hmm.
And it's kind of like they have to basically do something that they create a space for themselves, but also not alienate the technology companies that may or may not choose to go and be in their market, right? I think it's a
Right.
funny thing about this to go and recognize that there really is a market in that. There's a market in regulation across things. And I think to the
Sure.
extent that we basically have different jurisdictions around the world, then we're in a situation where it's kind of like people try things out and find out whether they've gone too far or haven't gone far
Sure.
enough, and that kind of thing. But it all tends to kind of like equalize over time a bit. So I don't know.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that works, because again, I mean, I just see how fast technology software evolves. That's not slowing down. You
Mhm.
start thinking about if AI really starts to crank forward, and I don't know. I'm always a little skeptical with AI, just because I mean, for the last 40 years, it's, oh, just wait 10 years. AI is going to be, just wait 10 years. AI is going to be.
Mhm.
Maybe we're finally getting into that zone, but there's a big leap between even the chat bots that's giving you a pretty reasonable looking paper that you might be able to
Mhm.
submit to your professor, and whether or not they figure out it wasn't written by you or not, who knows. But going all the way to more that self-awareness kind of thing, or that you could pass the Turing test, I'm still a little skeptical on that one, but we'll
Yeah,
see.
me too. And it's a weird thing about this too, because it kind of gets back to the self-driving car problem in a way. It's like, um, how far is it before like AI generates a program that you don't have to test, right, in order to go and actually
Hmm.
know that it's doing the thing that you intended, right?
Hmm.
So it's kind of like there's this thing of kind of like the thing that you generate, but then you always need something or some person more capable than the thing that you had to go and actually vet its use in an environment.
Right.
And so I think I'm seeing a lot of that now with like code generated by AI systems. It's kind of like it's cool, but basically you have to have some awareness in order to actually go and use this. And if you don't, you're just generating bugs. And I guess the interesting question is whether fewer bugs are generated without oversight than the average programmer does. And I guess that's when we
Right.
get
Right.
into
It's a good
dynamics.
point. That's a good
So,
point. We've worked with some folks. We're like, we should probably replace you with AI. That wouldn't be so bad. Well, Fuel Stable says that if you regulate it, slows down, will be more costly, and that's true. And then I think there's also of course, there's always pros and cons, but
yeah.
I think is a really good point that he made, that flight car industry wasn't a lot of that regulation when that started either, and then
Hmm.
eventually some rules came into play and things changed. Whether that was better or worse, I guess, is open for debate. I read a
Yeah.
piece about this road in Long Island that's one of the most dangerous roads in America, basically, for pedestrians and
Hmm.
people on bikes. It's this 8-lane monstrosity, at least by the writer's admission,
Hmm.
and that didn't start that way.
Hmm.
It certainly was it was bike friendly in the beginning, and then as it grew and grew, that all got thrown out the window. So it'd be interesting to see if we are able to put this genie back in the bottle, and what that might look like, and when
Yeah.
that might take
And
effect.
I have a real suspicion with this, and it's kind of like that as long as software is the area of growth or the area where growth happens in the economies, people will be reluctant to kind of like
Mm,
overregulate it to some degree. But I think if there was something that displaced it in that sense, and they became more like utility in a sense, then you start moving towards the regulatory environment because you realize you're going to be going in not getting as many gains from it, but that's
sure,
okay, right? So it's kind of like
sure.
there's that think economic tendency with it. But the thing that's rough is it's kind of hard to go and see, what is the alternative at this point? What is the thing that
Hmm.
maybe AI itself is actually the trigger for this, that it goes and gets things
Sure.
to the point where they're good enough, and computers don't mind regulation as much as humans do, I guess.
That's a good point. That's a good point. The venture capitalists might disagree. They
Fair
might
enough.
say, "Well, we
Yeah,
don't want that,"
but
but
they
but
would
the
have
AI is
moved
like,
on to
whatever.
something else at that point. But
Of
God knows
course,
what.
of course, cryptocurrency or whatever
Yeah.
comes after it, for sure. Although maybe we've probably put a nail in that coffin, but
Mhm.
Fuel makes a great point that good luck getting the AI to basically say, write me an integration between this system and this other system, and good luck. Nobody knows how that works. That will be, maybe that's the Turing test of AI when it comes to generating
Mhm.
code. If you can make these two things that weren't meant to talk to one another, then we'll know our jobs are gone.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's a weird thing about this too, because I think the market stuff really drives things so much when there is like competitive advantage to going and having additional software for things. It's like, you know, it's like that old thing. I basically said that, when somebody says that like all the software needs to be written will be written in a couple of years, right? It's kind of like I think human desire and want for new things always tends to outpace, the capacity of the technology that produces it.
Hmm.
And as long as software is in that frontier, it's kind of
Right.
like we'll just once we automate away the easy things, we'll find way more complex things to do. That's just what we are.
Yeah.
So
No, you're
yeah.
absolutely right. I mean, think about the systems that we wrote in the 80s, 90s versus what we're writing today. And
Mhm.
in the 80s, you never would have thought about the high frequency trading systems that
Yeah.
have dominated markets and sent markets onto flash crashes and things like that. That wasn't
Yeah.
even in the drawing board. Um, so what's going to happen in 5 years? I mean, there's that it's always when people try to be too, oh, I know where things are going, or this is the next thing.
Mhm.
We don't know until we're looking back, going, oh yeah, no, I think this cloud thing, I think it's going to be a big
Yep.
deal.
Yeah. And it always looks just like, oh, of course, that's the way it had to go, right?
Right, right. It's so obvious in hindsight. This all looks so obvious in hindsight, and
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're right, Fuel, that regulation tends to be driven by death and financial loss. When
Hmm.
people start getting hurt, physically, monetarily, that definitely does start to drive things. Sometimes we need a lot of that before people realize that's required. Yeah. So yeah, maybe it is cars and crypto. Maybe that's finally what kicks this thing going. But oh God, Glenn, really, we're going to date ourselves. What's the oldest app you've written that's still running? So Glenn says 18. So that'd be a very nice scotch, an 18-year-old scotch. That would be
Yeah.
a little early, but
Yeah, I thought for a while it'd be interesting to kind of like, reframe legacy code as vintage code, for instance.
yes,
Right.
yes.
Good way of
That
going through things.
I like heritage as another way of
Yeah,
trying to
that's good
spin
too.
it
I
more
like that.
positively,
Yeah.
because I
Um,
think that does tend to get a knock, right?
yeah.
Uh,
On the question, like, okay, so yeah, software from the late 1970s, that predates me, but the I did have somebody run into me at a conference a couple of years ago and saying, "Hey, I found some source code that you wrote back in the early 90s that's still in
wow.
production. I had to go and modify it." And I was working at a biomedical company. And it was
Oh,
kind of funny
gee.
because at that time, we really did feel like we were writing software for the ages because it
Sure.
was really kind of like tight regulatory environment and stuff along those
Hmm.
lines. And I was putting a lot of effort into it with my coworkers to go and sort of like um, frame this mathematical software we're writing in such a way that it wouldn't have to be modified.
Sure.
So
Sure.
it's kind of fascinating to see that.
I know I worked on an app in the early aughts, and I ran into somebody that had maintained it after I left. This would have been in like 2015 or 16. And they
Hmm.
said to me, well, I think we managed to finally get rid of the last of your code.
Hmm.
And I'm like, that's probably a good thing because I don't know that I was writing all that good of code back then. So thank you for replacing stuff with something much better. I'm sure, but
Yeah.
I'm certain my name is in some log file somewhere. There's just no getting
Hmm.
around that. Our old code doesn't die. You have to kill it.
Yeah, it really doesn't. I remember going to China a couple of times and consulting and basically just sort of like encountering applications that basically were built by one company that was acquired by another and another and another and then maintained in China.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's just like you're looking at things that basically it's, I don't know, it's, I've made this point before a number of times in my talks, but, software is just like biology, except that biology has death and software doesn't really,
Right.
just kind of
Right.
falls into disuse to the point where basically there's an advantage in replacing it. And many
Sure.
times that day doesn't come, and you just have like this incredibly, interminable maintenance phase, for it. So,
So why do we use legacy so pejoratively? Why don't we have I guess a more positive spin on it? I mean, nobody says, "Oh, my house is legacy." Most of us live in houses that are 10, 15, 20, 100 years old and don't think twice about it. But man, you use software that's 6 months old and people are like, "Oh, this stuff is horrible."
I think a lot of it is mental framing like that. But a lot of it is just frustration. People would rather work on the new
Mhm.
stuff, I think.
Oh,
Right.
sure.
And,
Sure.
it's kind of weird. So the book I wrote behind you, decades ago, working with legacy code, working effectively with legacy code. It's funny because years later, I thought it would have been great to call it The Joy of Legacy Code or something like that. And kind
Yeah.
of frame it
Yeah,
as an
yeah.
adventure in a sense, because I think that the mental frame that we use is kind of interesting with this. I mean, there are some
Mhm.
people who just really enjoy the hell out of debugging things. And I think there's that kind of adventurous spirit that's kind of necessary for going and maintaining older systems, is to recognize that, you're really on a journey at that point. It's like the people that
Right.
you could talk to are gone. And then you've got to go and basically sort of like look at every little artifact and try to figure out, piece together a story around that and basically not get too frustrated. I think for me, the thing that kind of helps with that is just, utter curiosity. And
Yeah.
the thing that mitigates against it is time constraints. You don't really have the time to go and sometimes understand things well enough before changing it.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That it is fun to tinker, and you think about this just from the complexity of the problem. That there's a lot of that in heritage code, legacy code, however you want to phrase
Yeah.
it. And I think that how you frame it definitely helps. But I think what makes it harder for us is, unlike an archaeologist who, I've
Mhm.
got a 3-year dig, we're just going to keep brushing off dirt. It's no, this you need to fix this today. We need
Yep.
this fixed now. And so you don't have that luxury of really trying to piece together and go, oh, I think this is a brontosaurus. Well, I bet it was this big. Or, oh, I think we have a completely new dinosaur here that no one's ever seen before. It's
Yeah.
stitch it together and get it out the door. And, good luck to you. It'll be
Mhm.
fine.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue. And it's hard with this too, because it's kind of like There is test-driven development, which the uptake hasn't been as high as people kind of hoped in a sense. But the thing that's kind of problematic is that there's nothing automatic that kind of keeps us within bounds in a sense. And it doesn't feel like there's anything that is in the pipeline to go and really do that, to kind of like let us know when you're doing something which is going to be unintelligible 5 years from now, right?
Sure.
And I think that that's like the real issue with a lot of this stuff, is that essentially intelligibility just kind of like fades over time in a sense. One thing that I kind of think back to every once in a while is that in Fred Brooks' Mythical Man Month, he basically talked a bit about what would we like to go and have like something he called a chief surgeon programmer team. This is way prior to Agile, and having like one lead person programmer and an assistant programmer and a documentarian and a tester, and just like what are the functions you need together in a very small team to go and get things done. And you can't just have the lead programmer, because you need the assistant in case like the lead programmer gets hit by a bus or something, right? So this is before like the whole multi-role capable thing of Agile came about. And the one thing about that I found kind of interesting is the notion that they had the idea of like a documentarian or an archivist whose total full-time job was to record decisions that were made within the team, so that you could have a record and understand what's going on with the system.
Sure.
And it's kind of funny because we have architectural decision records, which is a great thing to go and have. But I sometimes wonder, it's like if an organization was willing to go and actually try to go and actually have somebody with interviewing skills and good writing chops do that for several teams and basically make it a consistent effort within the organization, what the payoff would be, whether they could actually sort of like justify that over time. Because, we know that a lot of code just isn't going to disappear, right? And basically that we are going to have to go and work with it, over a long period of time. I think we live in denial about that a great deal of the time, and we just think of the new software we can write. But then, there you are 5-10 years down the line and running into the same problem that all your forebears basically dealt with in software development. And it's just a never-ending thing,
Oh man, that is excuse me. I love that you brought up ADRs. My wife's a business analyst, and I suggested that to her a month or so ago, and she was struggling with something, and so she's trying to get that instituted in her office, because it's the exact problem, right? You make these decisions and nobody writes it down. That's really capturing all that tribal knowledge. Because that happens on every project, and so maybe you and I paired on it, and so you and I understand why we did it this way. But if we don't bother to document that in some way, shape, or form, or share that with other people on the team, it gets lost to history really, really fast. And that's a fascinating thing. And it kind of gets into what Phil's talking about here with who wants to maintain old clocks.
Oh, never heard of that one before. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah. So the what it boils down to is, clock repair person was a burgeoning line of work, and not so much anymore. And so you've got like these clocks that were built hundreds of years ago, but nobody knows how to fix them. And so what do you do when 100 years later, somebody wants to go in and retrofit it or fix it or work on it? And it's like, nobody knows that. And, I think the difference for us is it's not 100 years, it's like a month and a half. So, I wrote that in Rust and then I left, and no one here knows Rust or Go or Haskell or COBOL. That's a whole nother topic, right? What do we do with all this COBOL code that's been written by people who just retire?
I think the real answer is being able to write software faster, right? Which is, a thing. And I guess maybe AI helps us with that, which is kind of funny. But, there is that thing of like, at a certain point, it becomes more economical to go and write the new thing rather than maintain the old thing. And, the thing I always kind of hoped for with microservices, that we would really get into this regimen of really rewriting things once they basically start to go beyond the cusp of understanding. And it's really kind of hard to find teams that really do that diligently, to go and recognize that, hey, it's worth investing an extra week or two to go and basically just, get rid of this particular thing and rewrite that particular piece. And, that's the thing. I think if we, I had coined this term a while back, code poptosis, which is kind of like, there's apoptosis in biology, which is programmed cell death. Apparently the cells in your body basically have this DNA encoding, which kind of like brings this process into play when the cell needs to die. And we don't have anything like that in software development, right? We don't have anything to remind us that maybe it's time to rewrite this piece, not because it's bad right now, but because it's about to get bad. Or maybe it's time to rewrite this because it's like the knowledge is a bit stale. We can do it better now. And some of the people that worked on it originally have left, so it's better to go and have the people who are on it now work with it. But it's like with that, you're always going and working against the the opportunity cost of going developing something new and meeting the market in different ways. So it's hard to go and see where that actually becomes a matter of practice. I have encountered some organizations where they do things like that to some degree, just because they're really diligent and they have the free hand to do it. But it's usually like high margin businesses where they can really develop a culture around that, which is
right. No, I think that's kind of what Glenn's driving at here, that, worked on an app that's profitable, their foundation of the business. How do I justify replacing it? It's working, so why should I bother replacing it? It's like, I buy a new cell phone every year because I like new toys, and we reuse the old ones in my house with my family members. My in-laws will use a phone until I'm like, dear God, please, you need to replace this. This is no longer supported. And then they're even grudgingly at that point want to replace it. So how do you justify that? Right. And especially in a lot of businesses don't have the luxury of having high margins.
So they're constantly dealing with that sort of thing. There was a thing I read ages ago that was really kind of fascinating. And it's kind of, for me, as a bit of an older person, I guess, right? I remember as a kid looking through catalogs, right? Catalogs, mail order catalogs for things and stuff like that. And particularly as we're approaching Christmas now, the Sears catalog was great for toys. As a kid, you're like, oh, yay, it's like I can get this, I get this. But it seems like a very interesting thing happened in the economy over the years. That's like if you go to a store and you see a shirt that you like, you're not really guaranteed it's going to be there next week or the month afterwards, right? Basically, people are cycling product so quickly these days.
Right.
And it's on a constant treadmill of innovation that it's kind of like people are conditioned to go and buy the thing when they see it, as opposed to wait and deliberate over it a bit later. I think the same kind of thing can happen with software. And I think it does to some degree with SaaS. I guess when you kind of like lock people into like a leasing or, service payment, type of thing, where you're changing things relatively quickly. And then the only friction that you really have is the people using it may not want to go and upgrade, so either you upgrade them automatically, or you find ways to kind of like, well, here's the area where everybody on the old cell phones live, but sometimes you got to sort of like march the product forward in ways that are better for you business-wise, not just in the feature space, but also the maintainability space. And I think that's an interesting thing. It's like, from a business point of view, I think there's strategies around this sort of thing of going and sort of like moving people along and basically kind of like cutting off the part of the market that's becomes unsustainable in a way. Transitioning people to newer products. And software might be a little bit easier for us just because with cloud and everything else, we can slowly change things and morph them in the directions to basically allow for better maintainability internally.
So, well, and to your point, look at how much software has shifted to that subscription. Or not just software. I mean, lots of things are becoming subscription. You can get cars as a subscription now. I know at least a couple major car manufacturers. It isn't just a lease. It's you give us this amount of money every month, and that covers your insurance, that covers roadside, everything. And basically every month or so, you can come back, hand us the keys, and drive off with a different car. So it's interesting to see people start to adopt more of that methodology. I don't know if it's better or worse as a consumer, but I think it definitely has some interesting ramifications on the business side, at least.
Yeah, it's funny, and it seems like a lot of things are moving that direction, and it's good. It's got some downsides too, like I guess the some being able to like remotely go and disable your car when you didn't make a payment, for instance, which I've heard about as well. And it's a really strange space. I think I used to get a lot more worried about this and get into a severe like Luddite frame of mind. It's like, oh my God, look at what we're doing, right? And at some point, nobody will own anything and that kind of thing too. But I think for a lot of these things, it really comes down to because things progress, there's always like an ecology around these things. There's always like spaces where some things are kind of like the old way and some things are kind of like the new way in a way. And I think there's something durable about ownership that is always going to exist as a concept for human beings going forward in some way or another. But anyway, it is a little bit distressing sometimes to think about some of these things. I think for me, in my lifetime, just the computerization of cars has been fascinating because I remember reading a story, I guess, maybe 5-10 years ago, it was like this thing about somebody going remotely through a firmware upgrade, going and actually taking control of an SUV and being able to steer it remotely. And I'm kind of like, I'd just love to have a car with no computers at all, but it's,
it's trade-offs
but you
though,
give up
right?
a lot,
Because
right?
I can start my car right here from my phone. I can see if my car is locked or not. I can unlock my car, lock my car.
Yeah.
Now, I know my previous vehicle, most of those features were a subscription deal. And so if you wanted to maintain the remote start, well, that's an annual fee.
Yeah.
There's going to be an $89 fee every year or something like that. I'm like, boy, that's kind of nickel and diming my vehicle. But we've seen that with Tesla where, the car is the same, but if you want the longer range, we have to disable some software. We flip a bit in the software that turns that on, and you have the longer range. They did that universally in Florida, however many years ago, when a hurricane came in. They just turned everybody's on for a week so they could drive further. And it's like, well, wait a minute. So it's not, I didn't buy a bigger battery. I just bought the software bit being flipped.
And in fairness, I think that was the thing, that was the configuration setting in Windows ages ago that would switch you from, kind of like personal to business. I don't know exact the terminology around it, but so we've had that in software for ages, but now it's just become, kind of like universal, ubiquitous across all manufactured goods to the degree they depend upon software, But,
and that makes me wonder, like, what are we going to see in the self-driving car space, especially when I think car ownership will change as part of that, obviously. Whether we give up completely on car ownership, I'm not as convinced on that, just because of how ingrained that is, at least in US culture and certain Western countries.
Yeah.
But the idea of, well, this self-driving car is cheaper, but we're going to stop at some sponsored locations along the way. And if you consent to us driving you by the Starbucks, and we're going to sit in Starbucks for 10 minutes while you go get a cup of coffee, or you can sit in the car if you don't want to get a cup of coffee, but we're going to be here for 10 minutes. What kind of interesting things are we going to see there? I don't know.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think all those things will be tried out until it becomes like a stable space and everybody's like, yeah, car, that's like a utility.
What will people bear? What won't they bear? And so Fuel Snable says they have a headset that has advanced sound processing, but I'm not paying for that subscription.
Yeah, and it is a weird thing about that, to go and sort of, I think when there's that old saying about, like, once you know how the sausage is made, and I think all of us in software development kind of, can see a bit of this stuff. And basically, if you have a bit of a memory of the way things worked prior to some of the more recent innovations, you kind of recognize it's like, oh, okay, it's like nickel and dimed on this particular thing. Is that where I want my nickels and dimes to go right now, or can I put them someplace else? Right.
The ownership thing is an interesting thing too. When you think about how many of us have shifted away from, like, buying a CD or a record or a tape with music on it versus now I just subscribe to music. And same thing even with movies and streaming and things like that. I'm always torn on that, because there's a part of me that really does kind of want to have the ownership of that thing. But then I realize, what do I really own, and what's stopping Apple or Amazon or whomever you've purchased that digital good through from flipping the bit saying, yeah, no, sorry, your subscription has ended, even though you bought this for some amount of money. You don't have a physical copy of it. I don't know.
It's it's very wild stuff. And it's like, I'm not like a big regulatory guy, but I think that to be able to use the word purchase and own for things that are like that is kind of problematic. I think we're way too far along in that space to go and actually,
and I wonder if it means as much to like the next generation. I guess I've never had that conversation with my son. I don't know that he cares about owning music,
Yeah, definitely. And it's a weird thing. This is kind of like, feels like it's a little bit tangential. I remember reading this article, a while back, and it was talking about, it sounds almost like a made up story, but it sounds like it's probably true or something like that. Something about like teaching assistants, I guess, in universities going and saying that the newer generation coming up, they don't quite understand folders, like having a hierarchical folder structure. And because there really isn't anything in their experience that kind of like relates to, because in UI design, we basically changed everything to basically be almost like time or search based. It's like there's a document you want, you remember its name, right? Or you look through history and basically see what you were editing 3 days ago, for instance.
Right.
And that was kind of stunning to me. And it sounds like almost like a Just So story, that it's kind of like, well, of course, it's like, it's like those young kids or something like that. But I can kind of imagine it being somewhat true. I should really kind of like check that out a bit. But I think there is a way that technology kind of like sort of moves us in these directions where some things that were just like considered just basic skills in a sense, or ways of thinking about the world, tend to fall by the wayside because of the affordances that we basically generate.
Right. Well, I mean, I think about hitting save, which is so ingrained in my brain. I just do it. And then I do it in places I don't need to do it. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to save this web page. The editor will save it for me, but my brain just does not have that switch. It's so
I do that still too. And it's kind of funny, one of the earliest blogs I wrote, way back in the day was kind of like saying, isn't save redundant? It's kind of like a funny thing to go and sort of like think about then and then,
but see, those of us of a certain age have had that experience of, I spent 2 hours working on this and now it's gone.
Yep.
And so we definitely have that sort of mindset, I think, of
definitely
reflex.
That's wild stuff.
Well, we got a couple comments here I wanted to grab. So Fuel says an interesting thing about, like games as a service. And then this point here, and we've seen this multiple times. You sign up for something and then they shut off the server and this thing that you bought is gone. And there's no, avenue for you to do that, as opposed to being able to just take the disc out, throw it in and play it. I mean, I think about some of the games that we've accumulated over the years that occasionally you still throw in because they're kind of fun for an hour or two here and there. But imagine if that was on a server that somebody decided, I don't want to pay for the server anymore, so I shut it off. And now, as Fuel says, it's toast. It's no longer there. And to your point, I think that'll just be part of that experimenting of, if enough people revolt against that concept, then
or maybe people get used to it. It's kind of funny because it seems like a lot of I'm not into gaming at all, but it's kind of like the thing of people having like videos of playthroughs might be the way that people are able to go and like have nostalgia about those things. But it is fair that a lot of things that don't have an attachment to the physical world just basically become ephemeral and just matters of memory rather than basically something you can kind of like resuscitate your memory with an artifact. Yeah, same. I don't want to get
Fuel doesn't want to get used to it. Yeah, I understand, Fuel. Again, I do think it'd be interesting to see what maybe a teenager would say about that. But I mean, we've seen the same thing with when you and I grew up. We did stupid stuff, but people didn't have cameras with them everywhere they went. This stuff wasn't recorded for posterity. Nobody posted it on the interwebs for everyone to see forever. And so you think about some of the things that we could, I guess, get away with that kids can't today. And I've certainly seen multiple instances of kids, high school kids, you go to a party, there's drinking, and then you get suspended from the football team. And they're like, oh, how dare you? Like, what did you think was going to happen? Right. I mean, the rules are in place. You broke the rules. But that was a lot harder to do in the past when people weren't taking pictures and posting it to the interwebs. It does kind of make me wonder, are we just going to accept that people did things when they were younger that they may regret and learn from, and that's okay, and that's not a disqualifying thing? Because our pasts are in sort of the pre-internet era, and so they're hidden, so to speak. The next generation, not so much. So do you think we're going to grow up and just realize we all did things when we were kids that hopefully we learned from?
I think we've done that a little bit too. I think politicians sometimes, basically, if you dig up enough, you basically discover there's a lot of things that are just very shady. It doesn't matter where somebody is on the political spectrum about that sort of thing. So it really becomes the thing of like whether there's somebody, whether the person's popular or not, I guess, in a way, that basically some of these things from the ancient past are kind of disqualifying. And I think a lot of this also kind of like comes down to that thing as well of like, we were talking about regulation a while ago. It's like you need some kind of like traumatic event that goes and sort of triggers regulation in a particular space. It might be that there's some high profile news story about somebody who's universally venerated as a good person and discovering something bad, and everybody kind of shrugging. And maybe that kind of moves the needle on that particular thing, right? But who knows? I mean, it's really a weird thing. I think that, the ebbs and flows of these things in culture are just really utterly fascinating. And it's kind of hard to go and see where they're going to go with this. I do feel that there's almost like a core human thing of like people need freedom in some areas in their lives. And basically if they're constrained in one area, they find other areas of freedom as well. So we may not know what we look like in 50 years or 100 years. But I think that there's going to be some universals around that basically we're always going to have a free space for ourselves in different areas. Even people living in totalitarian countries have found free spaces for themselves. And often that becomes like a niche culture that becomes kind of, venerated later and found to be very interesting.
Sure. Yeah. So wait, I clicked on the wrong one here. So a friend of mine was a teacher, learned the hard way not to go out and drink in public, apparently. So only drink at home because then they can't take pictures of you, I guess, or at least it
Yeah.
makes it harder. But yeah, that's a good point. That people will find that space somewhere, or
Mhm.
create it if they have to. And I hadn't really thought of that, but I
I think
wonder.
it's the original Jurassic Park. It's kind of like life will find a way, which is like that
Yes.
one
Hmm.
classic phrase. And I
Hmm.
think that's just the thing which is kind of nice to go and basically remember a bit about
Right.
humanity. I think
Right.
we'll always have that to some
Yeah.
degree.
That's an interesting point. So I know we talked a lot about like biology as another way of looking at software. I mean, do you think that's what it's going to take for us to evolve software? Because again, we talked earlier about how it's getting more and more complicated. It doesn't fit in our little brains. Is that what it's going to take? More of a just like a different analogy, a different metaphor around code to allow us to keep evolving and finding
I
these
think that
spaces?
that helps to some degree, and to me that
Hmm.
feels almost like a very tangible analogy, or it's one that's very easy to reach for. And I don't know
Sure.
that I don't see too many things that disqualify that as like a good frame for going and using about software development. I think regardless of whether people encounter that analogy or not, it's the generational thing I was mentioning a little bit earlier, is that essentially people
Hmm.
become very used to like, well, this is the dynamic of adding features to things and changing them over time. And anybody who uses social media or just any other software in their lives, they get used to the idea that there's a certain pace to these things. And that kind of like helps them form more realistic expectations than we might have had earlier in the industry, in
Sure.
terms of timeframes for getting things done and stuff like that. So I think a lot of things are going to kind of even out just because, software's been around for a while, and it's like we're slowly getting to the point where basically the people who had great hopes for it being an instantaneous step change, for anything that you want to do in the world. Like I want an app that's as good as ta-da, and I want it tomorrow.
Hmm.
That's not going to be seen quite as realistically. And I think we're
Sure.
pretty far along the path with that. In
Sure.
terms of the actual maintenance and development, it's kind of weird. I think Alan Kay, the father of Smalltalk, said a long time ago that software development is like a pop music culture in a sense. Every 7 years it changes. And it just has to do with the fact that basically quite often people are in it for a period of time, then they kind of like graduate to management or move
Mm,
into some other field of work. So basically you have people going in sort of like reinventing things over and over again, and sort of like, just discovering things that have been known for decades.
right.
So
Right.
it's just, yeah, it's complicated. I think it's just this really long arc, but I think we're getting there in terms of going having more realistic understanding what software can do.
Well, and to your point, I don't think we appreciate just how many people enter this field every single year, and
Yeah.
how many people move on, whether that's into management, whether that's onto a new
Hmm.
challenge. And so I think there's a lot to be said for the every 7 years. It's why we constantly reinvent the
Yeah.
wheel on things that we've solved before and then pretend we've never done anything like this before,
Hmm.
except for all the times we've done this before. I ran into this definition of Corba that was something along the lines of disparate systems running on diverse platforms.
Hmm.
And I'm like, well, that's a pretty good definition of microservices right there.
Yeah. Fair
And
enough.
it's same kind of concepts, different
Hmm.
implementation detail. I mean, cloud, not that different from the mainframe, just very different implementation details.
Yeah.
So maybe that's it. We need these archivists to come in and
Hmm.
capture the lore, and maybe we need to focus more on our history. I
Yeah.
don't
It
know.
makes sense. And I think the thing that's kind of funny is that basically if you take a concept and basically kind of like trace it back to its like the very beginning, of computing, and sort of like see every manifestation that's there, it's not going to resonate with a lot of people who just really didn't have much of an encounter with those early technologies. But maybe they can kind of like go back through the history and stop at a particular point. It's like, well, I kind of remember that. Beyond this level, I don't really remember it. But I think just going and drawing that linkage together basically helps people
Hmm.
contextualize the knowledge that is manifested in new technology as it develops, right?
Right.
To go and recognize
Right.
that, yeah, this is kind of like that same thing over and over again, but maybe that's okay. But maybe if you understand those previous things, then you have a better frame for understanding this newer thing, which is kind of like that, but different in some way.
Right. Right.
Um,
Well, that's one of those benefits you have with experience, right? You start to see the patterns repeat themselves. You start to see, oh yeah, this is kind of like that thing we used to do. Maybe it's better, maybe
yeah.
it's not. and I think that helps. Like, as Fuel says here, Corba versus gRPC. Is it different? Or maybe the right answer is we just need a new programming language that's better than all the other ones.
Yeah. Note sarcasm. I love that piece at the end.
Yes. That's
but it is kind of fascinating too, because there are lots of things which get incrementally better over time. Like, say, it used to be visual programming was the rage, but now it's like low code in a way. It's getting better progressively over time, but it's also like I've seen, people just sort of like really over-index on that kind of thing and form businesses, and then it kind of falls apart for, I think, what should be known reasons now about why you always need to go and jump down a level when you're developing something. Sure. You need to be able to go and touch things at the lower level to basically make something that's going to be durable over time. You're always going to have a desire to do that sort of thing. And without kind of knowing that, you can kind of like sort of like, oh, okay, this is the thing, looks like it's an easy thing to go and do, and everybody's going to want this. And then you discover some limitations later. And maybe this shouldn't be a shock. Maybe if we understood those fundamentals a bit more, why certain things are attempted over and over again and maybe get a little bit better, but they're never the panacea that we kind of hope them to be. I think that's an interesting thing to explicate about.
Well, yeah. And I mean, we've certainly seen in our industry that languages, technologies that are better are not always the ones that win.
Yeah.
And they kind of get forgotten, even though they don't deserve to be. And, I mean, yeah, I agree. Smalltalk was definitely ahead of its time. And then C++, replaced is a strong word, but took over. Of course, this is where someone who is a Lisp programmer is pounding the table saying, yes, but what about Lisp? The one language to rule them all. But I mean, I think that's true of so many things. That seems to be.
It really is. And I think the one that people aren't really looking at right now, which is very important, is Erlang, right? I think with Erlang, it's kind of like, it's interesting with object orientation. There's like the notion of having these little pieces that communicate with each other and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's almost basically seen as like a messaging protocol that like Alan Kay and Smalltalk, early on basically saw. But I think what Joe Armstrong and others did with Erlang is really what microservices kind of want to be, in much the same way that C++ is what, or Smalltalk is what C++ wanted to be. I think if we kind of move further in that direction, we have some great capability, but it's going to be that thing of kind of like pulling things from Erlang over and over again in order to go and actually get where we need to be.
Yeah, and Fuel says, hey, that's 1980s tech, nothing to learn here. Yes, I'm being sarcastic.
Thanks for the notes.
We need something like that, don't we? Like, I'm being sarcastic. It's amazing how much of what we communicate comes from not the words, but from the tone, from our body language. And we need something in this written space that we inhabit, whether it's Slack or text message or some other kind of messaging system that says, hey, I'm being sarcastic here. Like I'm telling you a joke. Just doesn't come across well. We need a better way.
Emojis, right? There we go.
It helps for sure. But even that's like, what does this emoji mean exactly? And certainly I'm of that age where I have to ask my son to please interpret this for me. I know what a lot of them mean, but not all of them. But I don't know. One other thing I wanted to touch on, and I know we're definitely going a little long here, but we talked about AI a little bit. And I saw something recently about how AI is going to replace the essay. Essays are dead because the AI has gotten so good that it's going to take a couple years. Kids will figure out how to use them. Students will figure out how to use them. It'll take teachers a few years to figure out, oh God, this isn't the student didn't write this. And then it'll take universities, high schools, 5 years to figure out what to do about it, but the theory being that essays are toast. I don't know how I feel about that. And there, I know there was a student in New Zealand, I think, who was caught using one of these systems, and they said, this is cheating. And they said, no, it's not. The letter of your policy says you cannot have someone else write the paper for you. This isn't a someone else. I gave it the prompt. I read the material. I know the material. I'm just not an elegant writer. And how is this different from your email client saying you spelled this wrong, or this is the wrong grammar? Didn't you really mean this? I don't know. I mean, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is this?
Well, I don't really look at things in terms of like good and bad that way, particularly with technology, because there's for just about anything you can kind of like, think of that has positives and negatives, right? But I think we're going to adapt, and it's very much like calculators, right? Essentially, nobody really looks at people and says, hey, it's kind of like, I want to see you do long division, right? Um, but
Right.
it's funny. I was listening to a podcast a couple of weeks ago. Some people who were teaching assistants in philosophy, and they were talking about this
Mm,
thing of like you can write an essay now using these tools that basically just will satisfy just undergraduate,
sure.
essay requirements. And the thing I was kind of thinking was like, well, if you really want to go and like approach that, you just basically sort of like, if you're in the classroom and you have no access to these other things, and you do have to go and write, it's like,
Hmm.
do you have the skill to go and do that sort of thing? But the question then becomes, is like, is it really necessary that way, right? So I guess there's that interesting thing of the capability moves up the stack to prompting well the AI system to generate things, and then
Hmm.
curating what's generated in order to go and figure out what has value. And
Sure.
I think that that's really where things are probably going to kind of like move for some of these things. And it's going to be messy. I think a lot of people are going to be
Hmm.
kind of like, but you must know how to write
Right.
well, and you're going to do those
Right.
kinds of things. And I enjoy writing, so I kind of like hate the fact that this is kind of like happening in a sense. I think the other aspect of this as well is that at least the stuff I've been seeing generated by the AI systems has been too perfect in a way. And I think that
Mm,
there's this thing of kind of like we still have this inborn thing that we want to basically see authenticity. We want to know this is from a particular person. And I think that we'll probably see far more uh, slightly dirty in a way, slightly rough, content formed by people that basically signals that essentially this is authentic because,
sure.
imagine an AI system going and creating something this particular way. We'll start to go
Right.
and get a feel for the parameters of what's being generated and what basically makes it authentic and what doesn't. And then we'll
Hmm.
probably go and have place a premium to some degree on authenticity for certain things. That's my guess.
Oh yeah, it sort of has that more lived in feel. It's not perfect. Yeah, that's an interesting way to
Yeah.
put it. And so it'll be interesting to see as AI evolves more and more of the internet, because we already have things like that. There are already articles
Fair enough.
online that are
Yeah.
purely content farm generated kinds of things, and then what happens when the AI trains itself on stuff it wrote, and then
Hmm.
how does that factor into detecting this? Because I've taught grad students for many years, and
Hmm.
when you get to know them, you start to hear their voice in what they write, but you don't know that right away. And
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to see, is that one of the ways you detect this is, all of your papers sound the same. I can't hear this doesn't have Michael's voice. This doesn't sound like
Yeah.
Michael,
Yeah.
and how does that all play out? I don't know. Be
It's,
interesting.
it's interesting too, because I think there's a lot of essay writing that's really presentation in a way. It's like
Yeah.
you're trying to communicate with somebody and you want to be persuasive in the way that you approach it. So we
Hmm.
might, once that becomes commodity in a sense, opt for some far more direct ways of communication that
Sure.
are a bit rough in a way, and sort of like use that to, I don't know, kind of like, vet authenticity and also value, I guess. But
Hmm.
who knows? I mean, it's such a wide open space. It's going to be very
Right.
fascinating
Right.
to see where it
No, and,
goes.
and to your point, I think it's going to be very messy, and I think it'll
Yes.
it'll be. Well, I've already seen it. This actually happened to my son. I think this was last year. One of his Spanish teachers sent out this kind of strangely worded email that implied there had been cheating, and if the students would just come forward, it could all go away. But if they didn't, then there will be repercussions, and they'll have to take it up to the president and the principal and the dean and all that stuff. And then very directly said to him, "Hey, you used a verb tense here that you shouldn't know." And I'm like, well, what did you do? And he's like, I swear to God, I did not type this into Google and have Google Translate it for me. That's what she was basically saying, right? You clearly use
Yeah.
Google Translate. And so I said, well, walk me through what you did. And it was all in a Google Doc. And so he wrote the phrase, he wrote it out in Spanish, and then it squiggled one of the verbs. And so he
Mhm.
just right clicked it. And I said, wait, stop, don't undo that. Do it
Mhm.
again. Show me what you selected from the thing. And sure enough, what Google was suggesting was this verb tense that he didn't know yet. But he's like, well, Google said this was what it was supposed to be. So
Mhm.
I just did. Of course, that must be right. It's going to give me the accent mark or something. He didn't realize that it was changing
Yeah.
the tense of he used the right thing. He just, Google gave him the right. And so once he walked his teacher through that, then she's like, oh, okay. So that's like, well, did the teacher not realize the technology could do this?
Yeah, I think
Or,
so. And I think the interesting thing is at a certain point that becomes tedious and people just kind
Mhm,
of give up and sort of like figure, okay, well, what is the thing we're trying to get across here? What is the
mhm,
actual skill that's necessary to basically sort of, you know,
right,
function in the world that we want to kind of like cultivate? And when
right.
these tools are available, then basically this tool the skill goes up the stack. We have to go and sort of figure out the higher level skill is to approach with education.
I think that's a great point, because I always struggle with this with my grad students. I hate grading. I hate giving grades at all. If I didn't have to, I wouldn't. But
AI can grade for you eventually, right? So
right. Won't that be nice? That'll be my students will appreciate that, because things will get graded more quickly. I drag my feet on that. They had an assignment they turned in last week. They're like, is there any chance we're going to get the other one back? I'm like, no, sorry guys, I apologize. It's just not going to happen. But I tell them at the beginning of the semester, what I'm trying to get at is I want you to learn more. I want you to know more when the semester's over than when it started. And as long as you show me that, the rest of it to me is arbitrary. And so I try not to overthink that too much. But I wonder, what do we do in these larger factories, the wrong word, but I have a small number of students. They're all adults. I don't have to be as concerned with them typically as I might if this was a freshman class of 700 students in freshman English or something, where, oh geez, we better get this right. And what do you do then when you can't just apply, well, I know little Jimmy and little Kathy are doing great work, so pass them along. I don't know. It's going to be messy. That's the best way to put it.
And the interesting thing about this too is, like, if I can kind of like carry us back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of this stream, it's kind of like modularity, right, in systems, and kind of like the 7 ± 2 rule and stuff like that. It's kind of like, it really goes and sort of like, the quality teaching is going to happen when you basically have a small number of people you can concentrate on and basically see what their advancements happen to be.
Right.
You can automate that, but then and scale it out, but then you lose something, right? So it's kind of like this thing of going and having the local space, having the space where, where basically you can concentrate, concentrate on those particular students. And this is the thing I find so fascinating, is that particular thing of like locality, having benefits, and having like, and having modularity and stuff like that, and seeing that across all kinds of systems, software systems, hardware systems, biology, and stuff like that. Those are the kind of like foundational things that I think are really, really important, but people don't really recognize. It's very much like the thing of like, you're a fish in the fishbowl and you don't notice, the water because you're immersed in it.
Right.
But I think we're seeing enough about how the mind works and how structure works in the world now to be able to go and recognize these things and see them as patterns independently of the manifestation that they currently have in front of us.
Well, and to your point, some of the things we take for granted today didn't exist 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and it's hard to imagine life without them. And now it's what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years, what things are going to come along, what technology is going to be an accelerator, and I think it's going to be fascinating to see what that all means. And so Coda Sean says, what do you mean I'm wet? Yes, exactly. We are not even aware of the simulation that we're probably all in ultimately. Oh man, good times. Well, Michael, I never know where these conversations are going to go. It's part of what I love about doing this, and I never would have thought we would have dived into AI, to say the least.
But it's fun, So,
well, my friend, this has been a joy. I'm so glad I got a chance to catch up with you here before the holidays. I hope you have a great couple weeks. Happy New Year.
Happy holidays to you.
Fingers crossed our paths will cross more than once in 2023.
Sounds good.
We'll maybe in Barcelona again. That would be just fine.
That'd be nice. It's a good place.
Well, everybody have a great Christmas. Have a good holiday season. It's amazing how many things are going on this time of year. I hope everybody's taking some time off, relaxing with friends, family, etc. I'd say stay warm, but that only really counts for my side of the world. It is here right now. God. Yeah, the days like this, you really question, like, why do I live here? I'm not going to lie, but what are you going to do?
So you appreciate it when you're someplace else, right?
Well, there is that, right? It's definitely nice when you do appreciate summer when you have to deal with winter. There's no two ways about it. And it's a trade-off, Mike. There's just no getting around it, man. It's just like software. Just like software. My son always asks me when it snows, why do we live here? And it's like, well, there's reasons. I maybe can't give it to you right now. But it makes a lot more sense in June, July, August, a little less sense in January. But you just stay inside and you watch movies. What are you gonna do?
One thing to do.
Exactly. All right, my friend. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time as always, and we'll see you soon. I hope. Cheers.